Welcome to the Silage for Beef Cattle Conference. This was originally planned to be hosted by the University of Nebraska Extension, Lallemand Animal Nutrition, and Iowa State University, the Iowa Beef Center at Iowa State University, as a live conference in Mead, Nebraska in June. And due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have shifted to virtual, and this is the second of 4 webinars. The first one was held 1 week ago. We have this webinar today, and then we have one on July 21st, and then the final one on August 4th. The first webinar has been recorded, and the recording is posted for your viewing. If you missed that one, it's available from the Iowa Beef Center, and I believe it's also linked on the websites for UNL Extension as well as Lallemand Animal Nutrition. We're happy also to announce that we have been given permission to offer CE credits from the ARPAS, the American Registry for Professional Animal Science, of 1 hour credit for each of the 4 webinars. So that should be something that many people would be interested in. So with that, we'll get right into it. Our speaker for today on the topic of making silage under adverse conditions is Dr. Renato Schmidt. Dr. Schmidt has a dairy and beef cattle background, is originally from Brazil, where he obtained a Bachelor of Science degree in agronomy and a Master's of Science degree in animal sciences. He moved to the U.S. and earned his PhD from the University of Delaware under Dr. Kung, who is a very well-known nutritionist there, worked on numerous experiments evaluating the effects of different feed additives on the fermentation of forage crops, and specifically molecular techniques to study microorganisms during ensiling. He joined Lallemand Animal Nutrition as a forage product specialist in February 2008, providing technical support in North America and contributing to global and local R&D projects. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Schmidt, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Dr. Dan Loy, for the introduction. It is a pleasure, really like an honor, to be part of the program again. And for this session, this year, I'm going to talk about making silage under adverse conditions, as Dan mentioned. So the topics that I have for discussion, it's heavily based on the season that we had last year. So in 2019, most good part of the country, we had a very cool, wet spring that here in the Midwest, we didn't even have a first crop. Basically, it led to a late planting on the corn. And when it was time to harvest, people had to decide, okay, I need to harvest really early or really late, because we see here on the second topic, there was some excess moisture during harvest. So there were implications on the maturity of the crop, as well as the dry matter, what we should expect. And people that decided just to take their chance and harvest at the right content or high maturity, they had some interruptions because of rain events, even some snow. Also, then we had some issues with mud and contamination. Then I'm going to talk a little about problems with the snow that was so delayed, especially in the northern states and Canada. Some situations that this forage didn't even ferment. So what should we expect and how to better manage it? Also, since 2018, I've been hearing a lot about low inventories, low silage inventories. And this also would lead to a short storage term and how we can best manage the silage that is still pretty active at this time. Then I'm going to switch gears a little bit on some potential issues that we can face. For example, hail, storms, flooding, drought, all these situations that sometimes we're not expecting, and suddenly we're faced with them and we need to take like a really fast decision. And most of these situations, we see some issues normally with the levels of nitrates. So it's something that Dr. Jordan Bell mentioned last week, so I'll mention on a different perspective. And finally, I'll just give some also tips and some advice on the management level, use of inoculants to improve the silage fermentation, silage hygiene, as well as aerobic stability. So just this first slide is more like an introduction, like the basics in silage. How can we define it's an anaerobic process for the preservation of the forage crops? So basically, it's a naturally occurring process. The plants, they are colonized by this wide array of microorganisms, and it's pretty much like our own body, our skin. We have all our skin is colonized by microbes, and it's kind of like a fingerprint, if you will. And once we bring the forage, we put on the silo, we compact, we cover, and some way, somehow, it will become silage. But then we have so many different microbes, and we have no idea which population will be the dominant, and it will direct a particular type of fermentation. So this process can be very uncontrolled, and we can have a lot of dry matter and nutrient losses. The base of this process is pretty much conversion of soluble sugars, particular to lactic acid. This is the very strong acid. Then it would lead to a sharp drop on the pH, preserve most of the nutrients and dry matter. But of course, we have so much things going on. It's not a sterile environment, of course. And we'll see other types of organic acids, some alcohols, and some esters as well. Now, the presence of air, we talk about the fermentation here. So the presence of air, it's the worst enemy of this ensiling process. And in the beginning of the process, during storage and during feed out, that's going to be the biggest challenge, pretty much. And in the end of the day, what are we looking for? Well, we want to retain the original nutrients and dry matter and create a stable product. So when we think of retain the original nutrients and dry matter, it brings to the point that we need to start this process with a crop that has a lot of nutrients and a high digestibility of these nutrients. So it's the beginning of everything. If something happens and the crop is too mature or you don't have enough sugars for the fermentation, then you can use any type of additive, or you can try to work the best on the management during the process, but that's going to be your starting point. So if there's a low quality forage in the beginning at the time of ensiling, will lead to a low quality silage as well. And thinking about that, this is just some general guidelines, what you would expect in terms of particularly corn silage in this slide. So we recommend to harvest between 32, about 37% of whole plant dry matter. At this time, the maturity goes hand in hand. So this is a perfect stage of maturity for ensiling. There's a good starch content, good digestibility of the starch, as well as the fiber. And the physical characteristics of the plants are really good too for a good packing, so a good ensiling. There's still some people that like to go. I have this picture here on the right with the kernel that's showing the milk line. Some people like to go through that, but I still recommend to evaluate using either a microwave, a coaster oven, one of those handhelds, those portable NIRs. Now, there are so many different devices, air fryer, so you can be a lot more accurate on the dry matter evaluation. Now, as happened last year, some people had to harvest really early, and other people decided to harvest a little late, or they could not do anything about it. So what type of scenarios we should expect on that happen? If it's harvest too early, then it's pretty much like we have a lot of moisture in the forage mass. So once we start packing, it's like a sponge with a lot of moisture. You squeeze and you see all the water running. And in this case, with the forage mass, we start squeezing not just moisture, but also a lot of the soluble nutrients. So we're losing dry matter, nutrients, and we start having issues with odor, with soil water contamination. Also because there's so much moisture, we start having some issues with the prolonged fermentation. So if you think of a cup of water and a pitcher of water, you want to make some lemonade. So one, you squeeze like a half a lime and you're good. And the other one, you have to use like 2 or 3 different, more lemons. So it's kind of like the same. We need to pickle the forage mass. So the bacteria, they have to produce a lot more acid. They're pretty much like working overtime. So this leads to more use of nutrients. So nutrient loss, dry matter loss, and more acid will be produced just to pickle everything. So this might even have some issues with the intakes if the acid load is really high. And an early or immature corn will have a lower content of starch just because we didn't we wouldn't allow it to accumulate starch in the kernel. So there's a lower energy value. Now, if it's harvested too late, on the other side of the spectrum, then we start having the issues just because the material is so drier. We have some issues with the poor packing. We still have air trapped in the forage mass, allowing plant respiration, allowing aerobic microbe activity, excess heating, dry matter, nutrient loss. At this time, the processing of the kernels and the chop length will become more critical. You can reduce the size, you can crank those processing rolls, but still, there's just so much you can do, and then you start missing on the chop length, for instance, you start missing on the scratch factor, on the chop length and the rumination. So then you have to think, okay, I'm gonna lose a little on the effective fiber, but I'll have a better ensiling overall. Then you need to start picking your battles and see which one you need to go to. Also in this case, we'll have a lot more starch accumulating in the kernels. However, this starch with the late maturity will be involved on this protein matrix and will be less available for digestion. So then we start having some issues with the low digestibility of the starch as well. This next slide, it's some research that was done with F. Thomas when he was at the Miner Institute in New York. And we see there is a corn silage that was ensiled at immature stage, 29% dry matter, and at an adequate stage of maturity around 34% dry matter, just perfect there. And I hear like, oh, if you ensile a little immature, then you got more weight, thinking of more water, but that you see that that's not the case. It's okay, you have some water here that's immature, but then when it's getting more mature, you got more weight on the starch accumulation. And we see here on these other two rows, so we got more grains percentage-wise, as well as the amount of starch, comparing the immature to the corn that was harvested at adequate maturity. Thinking about the starch digestibility, these are some electric micrographies with high moisture corn from research that we collaborate with Pat Hoffman when he was at the University of Wisconsin. And we see, first of all, an effect of two different hybrids at two different moistures. So this one here at the time of ensiling, that is at day 0. So we see a lot of this sort of like a cement-like. That's the protein that's just around the starch granules. And on this other hybrid, it doesn't look to be as hard, as bad, as involved. So we see there is an impact of the moisture of the plant, the hybrid type, and looking at these other two pictures here on the bottom, that was the high moisture corn after 8 months of storage. You see there is a lot more space for the digestion and attack of the starch. So then we start thinking, okay, I'm gonna harvest my corn. It's too late, too mature, or a little immature. So you're gonna see one of these different situations. You have to start feeding right away. Then you start seeing these issues with the low starch digestibility, or if it's been cooking for a while, then they start to be more available. So it's something like this next slide. We see the storage time. Here it's 0, 1, 4, and 8 months of storage, in this case for corn silage. And there is like a steady increase on the digestibility of the starch. So if we can afford just to let that corn silage or high moisture corn, earlage, snappage for like 3 or 4 months, then we have a nice bump on the digestibility of the starch. So ideally, and always keep in mind, the starch will be changing over the storage. So it's always nice just to send for analysis and see where you are to best balance the ration. Okay, so we still can work the processing on the corn silage or high moisture corn and try to make it more available in a worst case scenario, but it's not really, as here on the slide, it's not really total like a slam dunk. This graph on this meta-analysis, it evaluates the total track starch digestibility, and we see all these different ranges of dry matter. So we have like really wet here on 28% or lower, 28, 32, 32, 36. So first, when the corn is immature, we don't see really an effect on processing and the starch digestibility. If it's below 32%, the research shows that you don't get as much, or if anything. Now, when you go to that adequate or recommended dry matter range, especially here 32 to 36, or even 36 to 40, that's when you get the most of response comparing processed to unprocessed kernels. And then when you look at the other side here of this graph, that's 40% dry matter or higher, okay, you can tighten those rows and you can try to get the most out of it, but there's just so much that you're going to improve on that starch stability. And then you also have to think about, okay, how much more fuel I'm burning, the maintenance, the wear and tear on the machinery. So you have all those little points also to consider. Now, this next slide, last week, Dr. Bell went really through to some other options like sorghum, so I'm not going to touch on that. And I just have this slide on, generally on small grains, but it's on triticale. And I borrowed this slide from Matt Akins here at the University of Wisconsin. And it's just show all these different stages of maturity and the days to get to each of this stage. And it's just nice that shows the typical, along with the maturity, we start, decreasing some of the nutrients. We see the crude protein here on the bottom left goes down pretty deep. The levels of NDF starts to go up. And on the TDN, on the total digestible nutrients, it starts really high because right in the beginning, before boot stage, the digestibility of the fiber, it's just, everything is almost, it's rock fuel. It's really, really good. And we also have the high level of protein. Okay, when we get to the dough stage, we get some starch accumulation. But when we think of all the nutrients, in the beginning, you get more, depending what you need. If you want a little more on the tonnage and you're okay with just the starch accumulation, or if you really are concerned about like the high fiber digestibility, high crude protein, then you go at an earlier stage. Then, of course, you have to work wilting the plant and everything. If you wait to the dough stage, then it's pretty much go to the field and start ensiling right away. Now, this slide, we talk about the maturity. In general, when you think of small grains or even legumes and grasses, we go from that vegetative stage to the reproductive phase. We see a really deep in the quality of the plant. And in terms of moisture or dry matter, in general, in haylage, if we are too wet, normally we start seeing some issues with Clostridia activity. And I have a couple of slides on that. That's a real concern, especially on some grasses and legumes, alfalfa. It's characterized by a protein degradation. A lot of the byproducts, they're toxic, they're just not good. High dry matter energy losses, about at least 50% is gone. And some of the end products, they are not beneficial to the animals at all. You end up with a low digestibility material, and sometimes you cannot even feed, depending how bad the fermentation went. And then also we also have the same problems with a lot of moisture, prolonged fermentation, some of the seepage or nutrient runoff that I mentioned for the corn. And when it's too dry, in case of the haylage, sometimes it gets really, really dry, that it limits severely the desired fermentation by the lactic acid bacteria. But it is still enough or more than enough for mold activity. Molding, heating, poor stability, then high temperatures, especially when it's above 104 for a good period amount of time. That's when you start seeing these heat damaged proteins, that people call the caramelization or that smell of burnt tobacco. It's basically the protein binding to sugars at a high temperature and making it unavailable for digestion. So we end up with a low digestibility material. Now, specifically on Clostridia, I've been hearing a lot of questions about how to stop Clostridia or prevent their fermentation. Clostridia are strict anaerobe microbes, bacteria. So oxygen, basically, it's poisonous to them. And oh, okay, so if it's exposed to air, it should be okay. Well, the tricky part is that they form spores. So they're not active cells, kind of like a dormant type of cell, and they are really sturdy, they're really tough. So that's why it's such a big concern on the dairy, because if it gets contaminated to the milk, even if it's processed, it's pasteurized, it will still be active afterwards and be a huge headache on a cheese process or cheese making. The silage, everybody that had the pleasure to be around the Clostridial silage can smell from like a long distance. It has a high pH, and that's due a high level of ammonia and nitrogen, and also high levels of butyric acid. And normally you don't see, or sometimes you don't even see lactic acid there anymore. Also, there are formation of some biogenic amines that are toxic, leads to drops on the dry matter intake, reproduction. And people ask, well, what did it look like? Well, it has like a slimy, kind of a darkish appearance or coloration. It smells, some people like to say when I was in grad school, that smelled like death. And you think it's kind of like a joke. It is in a way, but when some of these biogenic amines, for example, the names, when you think of putrescine, putrid, cadaverine, cadaver. So it does smell kind of like death. And you know what? To make everything even, just make it worse, it does get worse with time of storage. It's not just something that's like a little wave, like a fermentation appearance. If it's still available, enough moisture, it just keeps going. So how can we stop or control this? Clostridia is sensitive to the low pH. So below 4.5, you pretty much control all the, the biggest species of Clostridia. We recommend to use a homolytic inoculant just to drive that fermentation and make it efficient, fast, and inhibit not only Clostridia, but also other microbes, enterobacteria, etc. High osmotic pressure. They love wet conditions. So if you can ensile at, at least like a mid-30s or 32 or something like that, then you also start restricting the Clostridia activity. It's also important to have enough substrates for the hopefully, the desirable lactic acid fermentation. In this case, it's, you need the sugars for the fermentation. It's like you have a Ford 150 Raptor and you don't have any fuel in the tank. So it doesn't matter. You can use the best inoculant or have everything perfect. You don't have the fuel, you're not going to have fermentation. So especially when you're doing, when you need to wilt, doing haylage, keep an eye on the time that's being in the field, the plant's respiring, burning sugars. If there is a rain, that also wash some of the soluble carbohydrates. Cloudy weather restricting the photosynthesis, delayed filling or packing, etc. So it's important to have that sugar available for the fermentation. Also, try to avoid as much contamination from these Clostridial spores. Contamination comes mostly with the soil, either mud or dust. Also, the manure application program and the dirty water. This is a study that was done at the University of Florida with a grass silage, very, very wet, at only 22% on the dry matter. And we evaluated the use of an inoculant, and we look at this graph, the pH drop on the silage on the haylage that was inoculated, it goes below 5 much faster than the one that was not treated. Then at 60 days of ensiling, that's when everything was open. We look at this sort of like a fermentation nutrient parameter, just with the most important items. The haylage that was inoculated was still stable with a low pH, higher content of crude protein, we preserve more protein, and we can see also with the ammonia nitrogen level. So ammonia, it's just like a byproduct of protein breakdown. So this is kind of like a thermometer of how bad the proteolysis went. Also 8 points higher organic matter digestibility, 10 points higher the dry matter recovery. So how much is worth 10% of your silage? And what happens with the untreated silage at those conditions, that moisture, it went butyric. So this is probably Clostridium activity. It could be also enterobacteria, but we saw 2.3% of butyric acid. So soil, not only we have some issues potentially with the Clostridium contamination, but also they're source for the enterobacteria, yeast and molds, and all these microbes, they are undesirable. They're not adding anything good to the fermentation process. This picture here on the top, it was taken last year, and I think a lot of people, they can relate to this type of memory, unfortunately. So everything was just mud everywhere. They had sometimes to transfer from the wagon on the field to another one on the road, so you'll not contaminate and just make the road dirty and take to the silo. So last year was a big challenge, was a real nightmare. And in terms of the ensiling, not only if you bring a lot of soil particles, you're bringing these undesirable microbes, but also you're posing more of a resistance to the pH drop, just because of the chemical structure of the soil. And this means a delay on the pickling. So the bacteria, they're producing a lot of acid, but it's just taking a lot longer to have that drop on the pH and stabilize everything. Also, an important point is that each 1 percentile of ash, it's about 20 pounds of soil per ton of the forage that you analyze. So it's just something to think, oh, okay. And of course, like Dan Undersander mentioned from the University of Wisconsin, dirt is not a nutrient. Also, during harvest, some interruptions that may happen because of equipment breakdown or because weather, heavy rain, and sometimes we have to stop the process. Just to keep in mind, we have all that juicy forage that it's all chopped and ready to go, and now it's just exposed to air. This was a study that was done at the University of Delaware, and we see the effect of the delayed packing, 0, 6, 12, 24 hours, in the population of spoiled yeast and molds. So not much of a difference after 6 hours, but after 12 hours, there was a 10-fold increase on the levels of yeast and molds. We're here on the log scale, so each number is a 10-fold difference. Another 12 hours, another 10-fold increase. So not only you see these microbes thriving, using nutrients, producing heat, when you open the silo, you're going to have this challenge here for feed-out stability, not this one. Also, some issues just to show on the production of heat, a couple of pictures, or when you interrupt while filling up the pile or the bank. These 2 pictures on the left was on I took in Michigan, if I'm not mistaken, and I was looking at the people dropping alfalfa in front of the bunker. Nobody was pushing, nobody was packing. So I decided just to go there and grab a couple of handfuls. And you see here in the middle, it's already kind of like grayish. So I could feel the temperature on the top was still nice and green. Then I took a thermal image with infrared camera. And right here in the middle, the temperature on the spot was almost 120 degrees. On the surface, that's still kind of like purple, bluish. And here we see that's about almost 80. So it's pretty much a 40-degree difference. And each 18 Fahrenheit increase in temperature, it's equivalent to 1.7 loss on dry matter. So this is about what, 3.5, even like 4% just by not pushing and packing when they get the alfalfa. One thing that's really common and we see very often are those lines on the face of a bunker or of a pile. And this is normally, sometimes we have to interrupt the harvest, something happens, or from one day to another. And at this time, you can pack and everything seems okay, but you still have oxygen that is in contact with that superficial layer. Even if you inoculate, you have the lactic acid bacteria, their metabolism is different. It's not the same as when you're, in active fermentation with no air at all. So sometimes we cannot do anything about it, but it's just so we know what will happen. And once we will start, ensiling and packing again, the recommendation is not like go with the packing tractor and pack before the next load or the next day or when you restart the process, because then the cells are a lot more fragile and we start just like smushing and breaking them a lot stronger. So it's just to start to spreading the new loads and then you go for packing. A moisture haylage in general, it can be a real challenge depending if it's still even like a small grain, grass, or legumes. I like this slide, this kind of a joke from Ev Thomas. You see the swath, it's really dry on the top and the bottom looks very wet. And in the middle, he's like, oh, this is just right. So you just mix it and you're good to go. Not really. You have a lot of inconsistency in this picture. So you look at the top here that is really dry. You got very, very low moisture, and you have the effect of the sun just hitting and kind of like sterilizing everything. So the microbial population, it's a lot lower. And on the other hand, here where it sits in the bottom, you got shade, you got nutrients, you got moisture. So God knows what type of microbial activity it's going on here. Just one practice that it's interesting, and I like to just to mention something that can it can be adopted, but of course it's a lot harder depending on the size of the operation. This is the whites, the swath width, and what they call the hay in the day. So you pretty much you mow in the morning, but enough that you take care of everything at the end of the day. On this study, we had 3 different cuts, and they were left at 4.5 or 8.5 feet. And we see how much it took to wilt on average of these 3 cuts. So it was half of the time to wilt. And you saved a lot more on the soluble sugars for fermentation. I mean, nothing really bad happened on that experiment that we got rain or anything like that. So we didn't have a challenge per se. You still had some sugars for the fermentation. But this is just something interesting that just to keep, in the back of our minds. And this was an average, first, second, and third cut, I think. And the second cut that was done, if I'm not mistaken, sometime in July, it was really hot, wind blowing. You have to be really careful because when it's really spread out, it dries very, very fast. But in the end of the day, we just want to make sure we got that fuel, that soluble sugars for the fermentation. Another option we can talk about, it's to use a combination of an inoculant with an enzyme formulation. This was a study done in here in the north of Wisconsin with alfalfa, and everything looked good except the levels of soluble sugars. On the fresh forage was just over 1%. It's very, very low sugar content. So we decided still to go ahead with the experiment, and after 108 days of ensiling, we look at the baleage that was not inoculated and one that was inoculated with the lactic acid bacteria and the enzymes. A big effect on the production of lactic acid. And again, you look at the amount of sugars, very little for this production of lactic acid. So I do believe it was a really nice combined effect of these enzymes. They basically attack a little bit of the fiber portion of the forage, just to bring a little more sugars and guarantee the fermentation. And in this case, the result was really nice. Also, it made everything a lot cleaner with no detectable yeast and molds. And one last option too, you can always add sugars, you can add molasses if it gets really bad, if for some reason you get rained on or something happens. And I personally like to see at the very least about 3% of sugars to have a reasonable fermentation, 3-4% that will be added. Now we're going to switch gears a little. I'm going to go through those different scenarios that I mentioned at the beginning. We'll start with the drought. I think it's something that everybody relate a little more. It's also was main topic of the webinar last week. This is the U.S. drought monitor from the UNL that I just took a picture that was released last Thursday. So we see that, it's not as bad as the one we had to face in 2012, but it's still on the western part of the country, it's at least abnormally dry. In some places, moderate, severe drought. And especially with, it seems that every year is getting hotter and hotter. It's something that we need to be always careful with. Characteristics of drought-stressed forage, and we think of drought, basically we're not going to have enough water for the plant to express the genetic potential, either in distribution or quantity. And this, as was discussed last week, it will lead to a low starch content, especially if it's really hot during the pollination phase and you're not going to see a lot of kernels being formed. As a consequence, you're still going to have some high levels of soluble sugars because they will not going to be converted to starch, and proportionally higher fiber content. Overall, low dry matter yield. It's going to be a very restricted, photosynthesis rate and extent. Also, like it was very nice discussed last week, you're going to start to see some issues with the heavier insect pressure, spider mites, sugarcane aphids in sorghum, etc. Also, we might have some issues or a higher probability of aflatoxins. So they like dry, hot weather. But then I'm thinking of the Aspergillus ear rot. So if there are no ears, it gets that bad, then probably you're not going to have the issues with the potential of aflatoxins. And elevate contents of nitrates in this drought-stressed forage. Nitrates, why are we so concerned about that? Well, in the animals, they're converted to nitrites that interferes with the blood hemoglobin, preventing normal oxygen uptake by the blood. And the symptoms that we see on the animal, it's something like asphyxiation, so accelerate the heartbeat, blue coloration of mucous membranes, muscular weakness, tremors, etc., immunosuppression, diarrhea, all those, the other common symptoms. And looking at a drought-stressed corn plant, we see here first the levels on the ear and in the leaves, so they're pretty, low. And we fractionated this plant in 3. So on the top third, it's about 153 parts per million, center just over 100 ppms, but the bottom is 5,500 ppms of nitrate. So that's where it accumulates the heaviest. So how can we deal with this? Nitrate levels in the drought-stressed forage. Initially, you get suspicions, test the forage before chopping to see how much of a challenge you have and if you need to raise the cutter bar. So you raise the cutter bar, you leave that nitrate, you're going to leave some tonnage as well, but you leave the nitrates in the field. Also, you test the forage before feed out, just to make sure and to know exactly where you are. We see here in the bottom, the ensiling process reduced nitrates in about 40%, but then it's always advisable if you're really on that risk of high nitrates to see exactly where you are, and also if you have some issues with the high nitrate levels in the water. Finally, wait 4 to 5 days to chop the heavily rained on drought-stressed forage. Because if you look again at the picture, you have a lot of the nitrates, right here on the top, on the surface, on the top of the soil. And once we get the moisture, the plant will just start to suck them up. And the plant will not have the capability of converting these nitrates to protein in the leaves. That's why they will accumulate once you get all that moisture available. Also, when we have high nitrates, start having some issues with production of silo gases, specifically nitrogen dioxide. So this is a heavy gas, accumulates in the low areas. We have more gas produced, also some methane, CO2, but all these gases, they can go from a colorless to a reddish brown. And with the NO2, it's more like this orange type of coloration. It may even stain the forage in severe cases, as we can see on this picture here on the bottom of the silage. And it can even stain your clothes, leaving with the orange color. So it gets to the point that your clothes are getting stained, then I think you have to make like a really fast decision to run away because you're too close and this is just too dangerous, especially in that initial week or 10 days after you put up the forage. Okay, now we're gonna really change gears from drought to flood. And okay, how likely is that to happen? Well, maybe unlike, but then you never know when it's gonna happen. Like this, and a lot of this research that we talk about, we see a lot of data about the plants on the field, but not a whole lot in terms of effects on the ensiling. So this was a specific research that was done after the Hurricane Irene hit the Northeast and was, I think, like the 5th worst hurricane in history. We see some pictures how, you know, the plants look like. The years they were all damaged, the plants covered in silt and all this lodging on the fields. So it was a perfect, I guess, situation, like very real, to evaluate the effects of a hurricane on ensiling, on some organoleptic characteristics of the plants. Half of them, they had abnormal appearance, dark grayish or green color, black kernels, moldy. A third of them had some type of abnormal smell, depending on what happened. You know, you got some sulfur or something that smelled like rotten eggs, vinegar with acetic acid starts piling up, nutty or musty smells. And in some cases that the plant was, or the soil was just too saturated or even like submerged, after 2 or 3 days, the plant dies just because the plant doesn't have enough oxygen in the roots. So this is the study comparing the plants that were lodged for 2 weeks compared to those that were still standing. I got some busy slide, but I highlighted in red what I want to talk about. So I think the one is, first is the difference on the dry matter level, this plant that was probably dead and was losing moisture more rapidly, and also had a much lower content of soluble sugars. So this is still was not really like a huge limitation to the fermentation. And that's pretty much what we're gonna see on this next slide. So we have the fermentation profile, the control plants that they were not hit by the hurricane, they were not lodged, and those that were the hurricane corn, if you will. So I have the average here that's surrounded by the red line. And we see there is not much of a difference, kind of like a pH a little higher on the affected plants. The fermentation profile not too different at all, like almost a 2-to-1 lactic to acidic ratio, and not a whole bunch of difference really. You know, some more like a variation, the range of the minimum and the max value when we start looking at these parameters from the plants that were affected by the hurricane. On this nutrient profile, we start seeing a little more difference. So a lower energy content on these plants, also a much lower fiber digestibility. We look at the starch percentage. Oh, it's not too different, only 2 points or almost 3 points different. The hurricane corn with the positive control or negative control actually. But we see the variation. It went some plants with 7% of starch all the way to 42. So they were just like all over the place. And it's just something, you know, have to keep in mind. We want consistency is one of the points also why to make silage. You have a consistent feed and you need to worry too much how much of variation you're going to see when you're preparing the ration. Of course, the big effect was on the ash content. It went from 3.8 to 8.9, so extra 5 points or another 100 pounds of soil per ton of forage that you're bringing in. And in some cases here, 28% of ash. So what, 25% extra dirt or soil or, you know, just foreign material that you're bringing in. And also it was a material that was more contaminated that was lodged. So this is about 400 or 500 times higher than the one that was still standing. Also big difference we saw on levels of, in this case, iron and aluminum. So of course, because of the soil contamination and a little more on the levels of mycotoxin of DON. And it brings to the point again, on that range that went in some place all the way to 15 ppms. So really, in terms of ensiling, the corn was pretty forgiving and had enough sugars and went to a fairly normal fermentation, if you will. And just the variability was really high. Some of these minerals, and I guess the worst was on the machinery, just will be covered in silt at that time. Also, just going to speak a little on the effects of physically damaged plants. You know, just like thinking of the hurricane or a hailstorm or some pest infestation, something that will expose the plant and make it more like port of entrance to these yeast or molds or other undesirable microbes. This was actually an experiment that when I was in grad school, I participated, and we exposed the ears of the corn. We damaged some 9 days prior to the harvest, and we damaged some 27 days prior to the harvest. So you see the effect that you're exposing and just damaging a little the plant or the ear, you see the appearance of each one of these. And the big effect was actually on the amount of mycotoxins. So we see here not a whole bunch of difference when it was damaged 9 days prior to ensiling, but when the ears were damaged 27 days prior to ensiling, there was a huge increase on all these mycotoxins, deoxyvalinol, fumonisin, zearalenone. So all of them went up, and they were, you know, as we know, kind of like a combined effect. So we have to be careful with this. Some take-home message in this case: harvest with these obvious signs of physical damage sooner than later. Again, careful with the nitrate levels because you have less of a leaf area to convert the nitrates to proteins, and the plant is also stressed. And specifically in the mycotoxins, the probability and the production increase with the length of time that the damaged plant is left in the field. So as I said, once you have the signs, you try maybe to get to that moisture, adequate moisture, and get out of the field. This is some study I want to just mention that was done with corn silage with the corn in Florida. And we see there's like a corn that's pretty clean in the field and one that was infected with rust because they could not spray under the power lines. Both were ensiled and treated or not with an inoculant that is targeting the feed-out stability with Lactobacillus buchneri. What I want to say about this study, the clean corn, we didn't see any surprise. Everything went as expected. But this silage that was made with the rust-infected corn, inoculation prevented the appearance of aflatoxins that doesn't have like really a direct correlation with the rust, but it's just opportunistic, you know, microbes, aspergillus. The untreated silage, they had 5 ppms of aflatoxins, while the FDA allowed levels, it's only 20 parts per billion. So this is 250 times higher level of aflatoxins, which is compared to what's allowed with the FDA. So another time that we got some nice result of using microbial inoculant. We're getting to the end here in ensiling frozen frost damaged plants. As I said, more on the northern states, and I got a lot of calls last year, especially from Canada. First of all, monitor, scout the fields, evaluate the extent of damage in the field. Were the plants killed? Are they still alive? They still can accumulate some of the starch. You know, it's going to take a few days, so you can just see the difference between the dead plant or not. Always check the moisture. The leaves, you look at the plant, the leaves look dry, but not really. You know, plants are just, what, 12% of the mass of the total weight of the plant, maybe 15 on those leafy hybrids. So it's important to check the dry matter of the whole plant. There's still a lot of moisture in the stalks and in the ears. Once it gets to 32% dry matter, in time to harvest, just get them out of the field, and the plants that were dead, they'll have higher chances of molding. So that's another challenge to keep in mind. And another reason, this one and the natural population of lactic acid bacteria at that time, under those conditions, will be low. So important to inoculate. When you're inoculating, make sure the calibrators are ready to go. The applicators are calibrated, ready to go. Monitor the lines and tips for freezing. If necessary, use RV grade antifreeze that's based on propylene glycol, so this is safer than the ones that are based on ethylene glycol. You can start to, I don't know, 2%, 3, 5, and go all the way to 10%. There will be no impact on the bacteria that's in the tank or with the animals. The low temperature during harvest and storage will lead to an inconsistent, even no fermentation. You open the silo, everything looks green, even smells. But it's always nice, you can even use those little pH strips that are available for a swimming pool just to check the pH. And you can just see where you are to see if nothing happened, if there's some fermentation ongoing or anything like that. If it's frozen, once the temperature starts to heat up in the spring, the plant will start to ferment in the silo. More on the outside, of course, that will start thawing. So we're going to see a lot of inconsistency then. Outside, it starts to ferment. Inside, like on the core, it's still like cold or frozen. So you have to prepare and test the forage to see what type of nutrients or challenge. Also, some of these nutrients, like the corn, the starch, will be with a very low digestibility. And because very little acid will be produced, we should expect aerobic instability during feed out. So heating, it's more likely. Okay, in summary, these compromised silage, they represent real challenges. So we got a lot of things to think about and make fast decisions. If possible, if you can segregate the storage of these compromised crops, advisable. So you know what type of crop, this one was hit really bad by a storm or by hail compared to the other one on some other field. I know in some places it's just how the nature is, and we have to bring forage from like so many different fields. I talked to one of our territory managers, and they had this pile that came from 30 plus different fields. So the moisture was all over the place, let alone the nutrients. Test the feeds more frequently. Normal fermentation profile, nutrients, maybe depending on the situation, mycotoxins, heavy metals, nitrates, whatever you think you need to look after. Change the feeds gradually. It's always advisable, maybe offer to lower risk animals first. So you're not gonna challenge, even stress the animals. And as usual, use recommended measurement practice throughout the process to optimize the ensiling. Every single phase, it's important. You start at the right maturity, dry matter, chop length, packing, kernel processing if necessary, or wilting, covering right away, use an inoculant, and a good feed-out management. So this is what I had to present. Thanks everyone that attended this webinar. And I guess it's time for some Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Schmidt. Excellent presentation. And again, you can type in your questions in the Q&A in the chat box. Do you see a difference in Clostridia issues between legume silage versus small grain silages?
Yeah, legume silage, they are more prone to Clostridia fermentation because they're a little harder to ensile. So they have a little lower contents of soluble sugars, they have a higher amount of minerals, organic acids, protein, and it just takes a little longer to drop the pH. So the buffering capacity is higher. In this case, if it's taking a little longer to drop the pH, then it's more opportunity for Clostridia to take over if they are like on the right amount with the adequate moisture for them and the other conditions.
Okay, very good. And this one actually comes from Galen. Has variation at harvest been compared to consistently, that is at the same average dry matter for losses and nutrient recovery?
Can you repeat the question then, please?
Yeah, and maybe, Galen, maybe you can type in any clarification you might have. So has variation at harvest been compared to consistently and then meaning at the same average dry matter for losses and nutrient recovery? And then he says, so, and then he, just to clarify, he says, showed drier and wetter material in the windrow Is that bad or proven?
Well, you have like a drier or a wetter material, then it's different in terms of the sugar availability for ensiling. It's also different in terms of the microbial population that you're bringing in from the field. And I think that's when it's, starts being like really important to use an inoculant, because you have some challenges in terms of having an efficient fermentation, maybe a little short on the amount of available sugars, maybe you have a high load of spoilage yeast or some other microbes. So there will be inconsistencies in the material, and if you try at least to drive that fermentation to a direction that will be more efficient, then is advisable. So of course you bring from different fields, even sometimes from across the road, and you have like a particularities in terms of how it grew, or the hybrid that was used, or the fertilization. So then we start getting really specific, but all those points, they play a role in the ensiling process.
Okay, very good. So here's a question you might need your calculator, but it's a little bit long, so I'll bear with me here. So regarding enzymes in inoculants, does the amount of enzyme increase or grow within silage once applied? If we are using an inoculant that is applied at 1 or 2 grams per ton of silage, and that has to contain all the bacteria carrier, food, and buffer, can there be enough enzyme to actually be effective? I compare to TMR added enzyme products that are added at 2 to 6 ounces per cow. The math doesn't seem to add up.
Well, I can speak at least on research that was done, like the one that I showed in the presentation, that it's, you just have something that will give like a little difference, producing a little more on the sugars availability. What I can say, it's important to look at every product on the label to see also the enzyme activity and what type of enzymes are there. Because sometimes you just have like, oh, I have this yeast enzyme, this another one, and another one, this amylase or cellulase or xylanase or whatever. But then you don't know exactly what you have there. So one point is to see the activity of these enzymes, if they are written or not. But in the case of the amount of enzymes, from what we've been researching and how everything was developed before my time, it's something that we've seen at least a benefit when we did some of these research trials. We do have also a different product that's being on the field like this year. It's a product for high moisture hay, and we do have a specific enzyme combination. And that one, of course, is a much higher dose. So what we normally see applying the regular inoculant at 1 gram or 2 grams per ton, that one goes at 10 grams per ton. And this has been done for almost like 10 years in development, especially with Tim McAllister group at the at Canada in Lethbridge. So I'm not like 100%, familiar with the enzymology, but I know that we've been doing these studies and seeing some of these results on the application of the enzymes.
Let's take 2 more quick questions.
Okay.
And because there are 2 more in the chat box that are quite interesting. So the first one is, with frozen silage, is there any benefit in using Buchneri type products, as they must be resilient to freezing temperature and produce a slow fermentation with them, producing monopropylene glycol?
Okay. Frozen silage, I think any type of inoculant, if it's really, 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 frozen, and you open, depending how you're going to start feeding out, if you're starting feeding out like right away and you're in the middle of the winter or really cold conditions, you're not going to see pretty much like any type of fermentation. So it's kind of like a questionable to use anything. Even if it starts to thawing and you start to warming up a little, you probably have some, it will depend how much you're going to leave in storage, sort of like cooking, just to bring the temperature to a minimum so you'll see some of the microbial activity. And if you apply Buchnori or if you apply a traditional inoculant, they're there and they'll do the job. There are some research showing that. On the propylene glycol specifically, yes, it's produced by Lactobacillus buchnori along with the acetic acid that gives that extended shelf life, kind of like a propacid effect. But it's not something that comes free. You know, it's some people like, oh, you have the energy value of propylene glycol or MPG, they like to say, but it's something that is produced at the expense of another compound. So when I think of Buchnori, I'm more concerned on, okay, acetic acid and feed-out stability. And of course, to see a full effect, we recommend to be, in storage under normal conditions, at least a month and a half, maybe 2 months if possible.
Okay, excellent. So we'll take one more question. And this question is, you commented about narrow and wide piles to wilt, but can you talk a little bit more about the effect of a different role to harvest grass and legumes?
No, I think they have like a lot of similarities in terms of how the maturity goes. Like, of course, we try to be, by boot stage with the grasses or bud stage, we start seeing those little purple flowers in alfalfa. It's like the quality is dropping really fast. So that's one thing. Wilting necessary. I think for the alfalfa, I would go legumes like 35 to 40% dry matter. For grasses, I would like to start being a little lower, maybe 32, 37 or 38. I think when you start going dry, you have a lot more challenge to pack it efficiently. And during the fermentation, as we discussed on one of the first questions, it's you have more sugars on the grasses in general compared to the legumes. The fermentation might go to a lower terminal pH, more acid produced, and the legume is just not as, let's say, insoluble. Of course, we make silage, we make haylage, we do everything, but it's not a process that is as easy as when you think of grasses or even corn, if you will.
Okay, excellent, Dr. Schmidt. Thank you very much. We appreciate your presentation. It was excellent.
Thank you.
Be sure and join us in 2 weeks where we will, Becky Arnold will be talking about tips and tricks for silage pile construction Tuesday, July 28th at 12:30. So be sure and join us then. And our last session will be August 4th with Galen Erickson talking about silage feeding and management for beef cattle. These sessions will be followed up by a series of podcasts that will be hosted by the University of Nebraska Lincoln. And be sure and apply for the ARPA CEU credits if you're interested in that. So with that, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks.